Philip sent ambassadors to the court of Shapur in 244, and once again, the Romans agreed to purchase a peace that they had no interest in fighting for. Shapur accepted the terms, either grateful for having been let off so easily, or satisfied that the Romans were admitting a justified defeat, and for a while, the Eastern Front went quiet. Philip left his brother Gaius in Syria, and granted all the authority a co-emperor might expect, Gaius then enjoyed a 5-year run as the unquestioned ruler of the Eastern Empire, while his brother took over the West. Philip was probably back at 5, and once he arrived, the Senate granted him the title Augustus and named his son Caesar. 2 declarations I'm sure that came only after suitable promises from Philip that he meant them no harm, and suitable threats from the Praetorian Guard that maybe he did. At roughly this same time, the Senate asserted just a little bit of independence by pushing through the deification of Gordian III over Philip's objections. Objections that arose, most suspected, from Philip's guilt over how he had murdered the boy. Philip's short reign would prove to be a microcosm of the wider crisis period within which it was set. His years in power were defined by internal rebellion and external invasion, and were it not for the fact that he oversaw Rome's 1000th birthday celebration, which we'll get to in a moment, his imperial career would lack any sort of truly memorable moment at all. This does, however, afford us a nice opportunity to turn our attention to one of those external menaces that would help make the crisis of the 3rd century the truly existential emergency that it was. I am speaking, of course, of the Goths. There's a lot of confusion out there about who exactly the Goths were, when they appeared, how they appeared, and who or what a Goth actually was. So I think it would be a good idea to try to pick apart a few of the theories about their origins, so we can have as clear an understanding about this great northern menace to the empire as we possibly can. In time, the Goths would split into 2 main branches, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, the former being the ones who first sacked Rome in 410 AD, the latter being the ones who set up a successor kingdom in Italy following the fall of the Western Empire. But right now, they were still more or less a single unified people. The Goths first show up in the Roman record around 238 AD, just as the empire was dealing with its year of the 6 emperors. While the Romans were occupied with their civil war, this new barbarian horde scorched down from the Ukraine, right past the Danube, and sacked the city of Histria, which was situated on the banks of the Black Sea. The size and the force of this invasion was so shocking that the provincial legions barely had time to react before the Goths had come and gone. For years, the assumption had been, occasional raids aside, that the tribes beyond the Danube were no match for the legions, and so, focused on the domestic situation, the Roman soldiers were simply not prepared to deal with the kind of aggressive threat the Goths posed. But now, they were all on notice. There are 2 main competing theories about where the Goths came from. The first states that they originated in Sweden, were pushed across the Baltic by a shifting climate sometime between 400 BC and 180, and then slowly migrated south until, by the 200s AD, they were firmly situated in the modern Ukraine. The other theory is that the Goths actually originated in the Ukraine, and that, like the Franks, became a military powerhouse when local tribes combined into a super-confederation, whose wide banner eventually supplanted their old tribal identities. Wherever they actually came from, by 238 AD, they were standing on Rome's doorstep, and more than ready to come banging through the door. There was a rumor going around, you see, that the Roman Empire was a paper tiger, that it was rich beyond imagination, and protected only by a reputation they had stopped deserving a long time ago. In just a few years, the Goths would come to believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that Rome was in fact theirs for the taking, when they utterly routed a Roman army, led personally by the Emperor Decius, who would die in the fighting. But that's for next week. This week, we will simply note the opening forays of the Goths into Moesia and Dacia, both of which dealt with persistent raids after the Goths discovered how easy it was to march around the Roman border provinces. Dacia especially stuck out like a sore thumb. Not particularly well settled or well garrisoned, Dacia was an easy target for the Goths. The Romans knew how difficult the province was to defend, going all the way back to Hadrian, who tried to abandon it following Trajan's death. But political pressure and the glorious memories of Trajan's campaign had kept the region on the far side of the Danube within the empire. But it would not survive the crisis of the 3rd century. In the midst of Aurelian's campaign to rebuild the shattered empire, Dacia would become a strategic casualty. By that point, 270 AD, everyone recognized that the province had become little more than an unlocked backdoor into the empire, and its continued incorporation as a province was far too dangerous to allow a little pride in past glories to get in the way. While Philip kept one wary eye on the Goths, he had to keep another on the internal revolts that kept springing up across the empire during his 5 years in office. There are reports of at least 4 separate instances of provincials, citizens, or soldiers attempting to overthrow Philip and Gaius. In the east, Gaius especially provoked revolutionary ire with his heavy-handed governance. Tax collection was harsh, and at least 2 of the revolts of the late 240s occurred in the east and were directed at Gaius. Some evidence even suggests that the last of these actually wound up claiming Gaius's life, but as with Gordian III, the actual circumstances of Gaius Julius Priscus's death remain unknown. After 4 years of uneasy rule, everything finally came to a head in 248 AD. That year simultaneously delivered both the high point of Philip's reign and the beginning of the revolt that would eventually lead to his downfall. The high point came in April, a month which the Romans had long had circled on their calendars, as it was believed to mark the 1000th anniversary of Romulus's founding of Rome. The citizens of the capital expected a party, and Philip happily delivered a magnificent set of secular games to celebrate. Now, to our modern ears, the name might seem to suggest that the secular games were a set of games that had just an ironic coincidence of naming, as the secular games were, like everything the Romans did, a highly religious affair. The secular games get their name from the Roman concept of saeculum, which represented the absolute upper bounds of a potential human life. When a saeculum cycle ended, which the Romans calculated to last 100 to 110 years, the reasonable belief was that there would have been a complete turnover in the living population in the meantime. That is, whatever arbitrary day you pick to start the cycle, when you go 110 years in the future, everyone who had been alive at the beginning, from the oldest man to the youngest baby, would be dead. The secular games thus held a particular fascination for the Romans, as they represented a set of ceremonies and celebrations that, theoretically at least, no one had ever seen before or would ever see again. The origin myth of the games reached back into the misty days of the early kingdom, when a Sabine man, trying to save his sick children, was commanded to conduct nocturnal sacrifices to the Celtic god Dis Pater and the Greek god Persephone, both of whom were strongly associated with the underworld. Over the course of 3 days, he conducted the necessary ceremonies on the Campus Martius. His children lived, and he was then left with instructions that the ceremony should be repeated once per saeculum from that day forward. How closely the Romans held to this injunction is unknown, but when the high priests of Rome consulted the Sibylline books in 249, while the First Punic War was raging, they were told that the prescription for what ailed them was to renew the secular sacrifices. This set was dutifully followed up in the 140s AD, but then, when the cycle next came around, Rome was too caught up in the fall of the Republic to remember. After Augustus became emperor, though, he decided he wanted to throw games better than anyone had ever seen before or would ever see again, and got the idea to revive the secular games in 17 BC. He revamped the ceremonies, instructed the priests to sacrifice to proper Roman gods, and introduced daytime sacrifices to accompany the traditional nighttime ceremonies. He also introduced the games, the banquets, and theatrical performances that came to be most closely associated with the event. Augustus was not reviving an ancient tradition just to mumble some words at midnight. He wanted to throw the biggest party of anyone's lifetime. After the secular games of Augustus, though, the theoretical underpinnings of the ceremony took a hit when Claudius decided to throw his own set in 47 AD. He had good reason to throw his games early, but Suetonius notes that Claudius was much mocked for announcing festivities that none had seen before and none would see again, when plenty of people had been around when Augustus had said the same thing. The good reason for Claudius's secular games, though, was to celebrate the revolution of a different 100-year cycle, as 47 AD marked the 800th anniversary of the founding of Rome, and Claudius didn't want the birthday to pass unnoticed. From that point on, there were two cycles of secular games, basically negating the whole not before, not ever again mystique, but the various emperors were not going to let an opportunity to associate their name with this most rare of ceremonies pass. So one cycle followed Augustus and led to games thrown by Domitian in 88 and Septimius Severus in 204, and another cycle following Claudius and the birthdays of Rome, which led to games thrown in 148 by Antoninus Pius, and this last set thrown by Philip the Arab in 248. The next time either cycle came around, though, the empire was already undergoing Constantine's push to Christianize, and like a dozen other pagan celebrations, the secular games were neglected. So when Philip announced his games and said that no one would ever see their like again, he at least was telling the truth. Philip's games included the usual sacrifices, accompanied by citywide theatrical performances and gladiatorial contests that saw 1,000 men and God knows how many thousands of exotic animals killing and being killed for the crowd's amusement. When it was all over, everyone agreed that the event had lived up to its billing. No one had ever seen anything like it before, and they could expect to never see anything like it again. Philip was the toast of Rome. But Philip was not the toast of the province of Moesia. The troops along the lower Danube had dealt with the brunt of the initial Gothic invasions, and so far they had not had much success against this new barbarian menace. It appears that in response, the regular soldiers of the legions were clamoring to take the fight across the Danube and into the territory of the Goths. The invasion would offer the men a chance to exact some revenge for their lost honor, but perhaps more importantly, it would give them a chance to plunder a heretofore unknown source of wealth. The empire hadn't really had a good sizable influx of slaves since the Marcomannic Wars, and the thought of selling off 100,000 Goths into slavery was a mighty big incentive to fight another big war in the north. But Philip was content for now to keep the legions in their camps. A northern war might sound good when it's pitched by grunts and to grunts, but up in the high command, they understood that the likelihood of success was low, and the likelihood of doing irreparable damage to the northern defenses was high. But that didn't stop the grunts from talking, and in time, it didn't stop them from revolting against their cowardly leadership. In mid-248, while Philip was back in Rome celebrating the capital's birthday, the legions stationed in Moesia rebelled, and declared a man named Tiberius Claudius Marinus Pecatianus their new emperor. There had been revolts before, but this one seemed particularly serious, as it involved